Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Today is Veterans Day, and obviously we owe a great level of respect to everyone who has served in the United States Armed Forces and protected the freedoms that we all have. And on that message, let's go down to the University of Virginia. Jennifer Lawless is an expert on politics and on American freedom. She's the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to join you.
Okay, let's see. Last week, President Biden finally got the infrastructure bill through Congress. How did it happen, and what's the implications from it?
Well, I think there are several different dynamics that are relevant. The first is that it happened because more than a dozen Republicans wound up voting for the bill. There were 6 Democrats who voted against it, and without their support, had Republicans not been willing to cross party lines, the bill would have failed. And so that's an important piece to keep in mind here. First of all, because Joe Biden can now claim credit for actually having real bipartisanship. There were 19 Republican senators that had supported the bill as well. But it also demonstrates that the Progressive Caucus was not kidding around when they said that they were not going to just roll over. Now, it's likely that Nancy Pelosi released these 6 members to let them vote against the bill, or else she wouldn't have put it up for a vote. But it does demonstrate that the Progressive Caucus does still have a degree of power. The other thing that I would note is that Biden and the moderates can claim victory on this one, because even though the progressives wanted to keep the infrastructure bill and the social spending bill linked, there was a vote on one and not the other. And that was because there were 6 moderates who basically said, look, until we are sure that we know how much the social spending bill is actually going to cost, we're not ready to cast a vote for it. The final thing that I would say about the infrastructure bill is that it's a monumental legislative accomplishment, and I'm still not convinced that the administration or the Democrats in Congress have figured out a way to message these achievements sufficiently. And so they still have a little bit of time. But, you know, if they would have had this win a couple of weeks ago, who knows what would have happened in Virginia and New Jersey. If they want to use this win to leverage success in the midterms, they have to figure out a way to let people know exactly what they've delivered to their districts and states.
It is remarkable how they've blundered the messaging on one of the biggest pieces of legislation. I mean, if you think about Obama's economic stimulus to come out of the Great Recession, I think that was $900 billion. This is a piece of legislation that is significantly larger than that. And, you know, it's the WPA on steroids. I mean, from a historic standpoint, they should have little signs and placards for this thing being printed all over the country. This ought to be one of the most significant pieces of legislation ever to go through Congress.
Right, and perhaps they will. Unfortunately, there has been so much more attention on how this bill has navigated a tortured process than on what's in it, that, you know, people are tired of hearing about it already. I think that Pete Buttigieg, who was, you know, making the rounds this weekend with all of the news outlets, and Joe Biden in touting the ultimate achievement, have highlighted some really, really important components of the bill and have highlighted the extent to which they genuinely are bipartisan and deliver to people across the whole country. The challenge is going to be whether that becomes the broader message that comes out every time anybody talks about this bill. And at this point, although I think there are some strategic, some strategic operations going on behind the scenes, it certainly hasn't trickled down to the congressional level, because when you talk to members of Congress and when you see them talking to reporters, they're not talking about, you know, what the bill is delivering. They're talking about how the sausage was made and what that's going to mean for the social spending bill.
Well, and I think the lack of definition of it is laying the foundation for failure, because the social spending bill is much in question. And let's jump over to that. This all really depends on a CBO score. The Congressional Budget Office is a bipartisan. I think everybody thinks it's a fair game. There hasn't been much criticism of it as being manipulated by one party or the other, regardless of who's in power. And they do an economic analysis, sort of a cost-benefit analysis of what these proposed programs are. It's a intense, time-consuming process. And if this thing doesn't come cash flow positive, this social spending bill is probably in a lot of trouble, right?
Well, this version of it is. There will be a social spending bill. The question is it going to be 1.75 trillion? Is it going to be 1.9 trillion? Is it going to be 1.2 trillion? And ultimately, what that's going to come down to, I think now, given that these moderates in the House have said, look, we're not willing to deficit spend for this thing, it's going to come down to what the CBO cost is and what can be taken out of the bill, or what kinds of tax increases can be added to the bill to ensure, a positive bottom line. So I wouldn't be surprised if the version and the framework that's currently being circulated in the House is not the final version that the House votes on and ultimately sends to the Senate.
President Joe Manchin does not seem very positive on this social spending bill. He seems to be walking further and further away from it in some of his narrative. Is the Biden White House have control of him, or have a steady enough dialogue that they're going to go down the tubes on this because of one vote in the United States Senate?
I think at the end of the day, the Biden White House will take what they can get. And even if this social spending bill turns out to be 50% of what the framework includes now, it would be crazy not to take it. It's still a major legislative victory. My sense is that they have an open and pretty consistent dialogue with Joe Manchin. Biden continues to sort of speak of him quite favorably, and Manchin does the same thing. I don't know that that's been what's communicated to the public, but I don't think that Joe Manchin is taking the administration by surprise.
Should the two presidents get together and have a summit or something like that? Could be in Wheeling, West Virginia. Be very, very good for TV.
I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is Kyrsten Sinema has come out, and I think she's realizing that she's been taking a lot of heat for being vague and amorphous. And she has started to, I think, take a page out of the Joe Manchin playbook, which is to communicate a little bit more specifically what it is that she's interested in, what she's looking for, how she's not thinking about being primaried or the next election. But I do think that if these moderates in the House ultimately get on board, it's going to be difficult for Manchin and Sinema, given that these moderates in the House have made the same arguments that Manchin and Sinema have, right? So if they're able to get on board, and if the CBO score meets their approval, then I think Manchin and Sinema are going to be in a position where they're sort of tying themselves in knots to explain yet one more reason why they don't support the bill.
Professor, let's talk about inflation. It's a 31-year high, 6.3%. It is causing some significant pain, especially in certain regions of the country. The Midwest is getting hit particularly hard. The Northeast, actually, a little less so, although people are everyone is griping about gas prices. That is, that's a weekly pain point. Everybody's talking about food prices. You are seeing substantial increases in certain areas in what you need in your food basket every week. Talk a little bit about the danger zone for this politically for the Biden administration.
Well, the problem is that it's across the board. So gas prices are obviously suffering. The costs are going up at the greatest rate. But whether you're talking about electronics or clothing or food, we're seeing pretty steady inflation. The challenge is that economists say that whether this is short or medium term, even short term, is many, many months. And a lot of it has to do with the supply chain and the fact that the global economy basically shut down for several months. And now that it's being jump-started again, supply cannot meet demand right now. So that's a big piece of it. And telling people that they just have to be patient and pay more in the short run is not necessarily a satisfying response. But in order to work out all of these supply chain kinks, it is going to take some time. Now, if prices begin to come down, and if it looks like things are heading in the right direction, and unemployment continues to stay very low, I don't know that this is a particularly damning factor for the 2022 midterms, but it does mean that at least for the course of the next 5 to 6 months, in a best case scenario, Americans are going to feel this in their pockets. Now, the irony of the whole thing is that even though the economic recovery has been quite substantial, job creation has been high, unemployment has been low, people haven't really responded to that or felt that anyway. So, it's not like this is inconsistent with the fact that people have just generally had negative reactions toward the economy lately.
Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit. I think on the midterms, this is an easy 30-second spot. Gas prices, home heating oil, food costs. You can juxtapose when the Republicans were in charge versus when the Democrats were in charge. whether it's
Well,
fair
what I
or
would
not.
say is I think that's going to totally be relevant for primaries. A lot of primaries, will be in February, March, and April, where inflation is obviously going to be high. And that's a bad message for all incumbents, right? Whether you're challenging a Republican or a Democratic incumbent in a primary, you can say that, like, this is the economy that this person has presided over. I'm not convinced that by the summer we're going to be in this kind of economic situation. And studies show time and time again that people judge the economy based on their own circumstances. And so if people start to feel that, oh, they're not paying as much at the pump, or they're not paying as much for a gallon of milk, it might not be as damning. That said, that's the most favorable prediction. It's very, very likely that this inflationary period could last well more than 5 or 6 months.
And why isn't he moving quickly? Why isn't he tapping the strategic oil reserves? Why isn't he banning the sale of natural gas and oil and other energy producing products from being sold overseas? Those are kind of low-hanging fruit and could immediately have a positive impact. I mentioned at the beginning that the Northeast isn't getting hit as high as other regions, but those winter heating costs are going to go through the roof, looking at 20 and 30% price increases over 2020.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he does. I think that the administration was waiting for the economic numbers from last month, and they're also meeting with top level economists, many of whom have different perceptions about how best to get a handle on this. And, so I think that there will be relatively quick action. I'm not exactly sure which actions will be taken. But I do think that part of the challenge is knowing that this is a relatively multi-month or a year-long problem. You don't want to sort of throw everything at it all at once when that raises expectations that you're going to be able to fix it, when it just can't be fixed because it's global.
And some economists, some leading business economists who are perceived to be nonpartisan are talking about that the social spending bill will increase inflation.
But there are also a lot who say that it won't. It depends what's in the social spending bill. And that's the other thing. We're all talking about this bill. It had been, 3 times the size that it currently is, then twice the size that it currently is, then paid family leave was out, then paid family leave is back in, childcare is out, childcare is back in, but for less time. Depending on what the actual components of the bill are and how they're going to be funded, there will be economic implications, but I just think we still don't know.
Okay, you're Joe Biden. You got one win. I'm not sure he's taken full advantage of that one win. The signing ceremony is, I think, Monday or Tuesday of next week. How urgent is it for him to, whether win or lose or cut it back or make it bigger, whatever size it is, get this social spending bill issue resolved one way or the other to be able to start to build some momentum and help out Democrats in the midterms?
Yeah, I think it's key. And there are a couple of different paths to pursue. So one is to figure out how to get people on board, even if it's a much smaller bill, and pass it. The other is to just be really upfront and say, you know what, this is going to take 6 more months. I'm going to let congressional leadership handle these initial steps, and I'm going to turn to other priorities.
And then the administration seemed to lose control of everything, kind of reeled it back with infrastructure after the loss of Virginia and the very tight race in New Jersey. Where are they? His approval ratings are just god-awful. We haven't seen him since the infrastructure bill. We'll see those beginning of next week. But he was down to 41%, I think, in the CNN poll. These are not strong numbers.
Oh, no question. And the president takes the hit for the economy, regardless of who's in power, regardless of whether you're talking about unemployment or inflation or both. It's the president who presides over the economy. And so, he touting the successes of the infrastructure bill will help. Potentially passing the social spending bill will help. Moving forward on some other priorities will help. But presiding over an inflationary period is not a position that a president wants to be in. And so, I would be very, very surprised if these numbers really, if we see any substantial uptick. I think he can certainly get back into, the high 40s, but it's not an ideal situation for any president to be in.
Now let's just pick up on the pure politics of it. Youngkin wins in Virginia. Chris Christie follows that up by really slapping the president down and the big lie. He does it very publicly, gets a lot of attention from it. is there now an emerging narrative within the Republican Party to push away the Trump era? And the fact that Chris Christie was a major part of his election team in 2016, he was thought to be chief of staff at one point or another, was a close ally and a defender early in the president's administration. Are we starting to see kind of some of the old guard, some of even the new guard, begin to say, let's move forward, we can really build some momentum, recapture the midterms, and then take back the presidency in 3 more years?
I don't think so. I mean, Donald Trump gave Chris Christie COVID, right? So if you're ever gonna, and Chris Christie was hospitalized in very bad condition. So if there's ever...
So this is just a COVID payback by Chris Christie?
I don't think it's a COVID payback, but I think there's no love lost there. And there's also very little in terms of the stakes. Chris Christie's not running for anything. Glenn Youngkin also had relatively low stakes. He can fund a $1 billion campaign on his own. He doesn't need Trump donors. He didn't need to get through a Republican primary because Virginia Republicans, anoint somebody through a convention. Here are 2 guys who have the flexibility to be able to distance themselves however they want from Donald Trump and really not pay a major price. I'll be interested to see, once we start looking at really hotly contested Senate and House primaries, what these Republicans are willing to do and whether Trump's candidates are the ones that make it to the general election. Because if they are, then most Republicans in Congress, I think, are going to continue down this path of it's just not worth alienating him. Those who many of them have already decided that they're not seeking re-election. His most outspoken critics are leaving the chamber rather than staying to fight another day.
Obama lost 63 seats in the midterm. What's the prognosis right now of what's the head count for loss of Democratic seats?
It's not going to be near that. So part of the reason Obama lost that many seats was because in 2008, the Democrats won seats that they had no business winning as part of the Obama wave. And so part of the 63-seat flip in 2010, some of it was the Tea Party, but some of it was sort of life just returning to normal. And with Obama not at the top of the ticket, there were Republican districts that were going to obviously continue to elect Republicans. We're more polarized now than we were then. The districts are more rigged than they were then. And Biden already saw a loss of many of these districts in 2020. So there's the potential for, 10 to 15 possibly, but I think that's even high.
Really? No 30 count? Nothing in that range?
I don't see it. When you look at districts that are marginal at this point, there just are not that many. Now, some of this will come down to retirements and what redistricted lines look like. You see incumbents lose more or not seek re-election in those cases. And so it's possible that we could get into the mid-20s, depending on what that final map looks like. But for that, I would say that in terms of people sort of representing districts that they shouldn't be representing because they're out of sync partisan-wise, there just aren't nearly as many as there were in 2010.
And the Senate. Give us a little peek a year ahead of time on the Senate count.
I think that there's a better chance that the Democrats will hold the Senate than be able to maintain a majority in the House. Some of it is because the Republican candidates that look like they're likely going to be the nominees in some really important states are not ready for prime time or are not sort of appealing at a statewide level. There's a lot of personal scandal, and there's also just sort of a lot of drama associated with them. I think the American people have demonstrated that they're a little tired from that. The other thing to keep in mind is that in both Ohio and Pennsylvania, whoever makes it through the Democratic primary has a really good shot at winning. There are really strong candidates on both sides. And so, if the Democrats can hold Georgia, if they can win in Ohio and Pennsylvania, then, life looks a lot better for them. It's a little bit harder to map out a set of, victories to get you to 218 in the House.
Does Herschel Walker win that Republican primary, and is he the contender?
I don't see how he doesn't win the primary. And then I think he's got a real problem in the general election.
He can do far more push-ups than the minister can. I think that's a given. What should we all be looking for over the next week?
I think that over the course of the next week, there are a few dimensions that are worth considering. So the first is, what is the administration going to do to celebrate infrastructure? And are they going to do it in a way that really is compelling, that speaks to suburban women, but also blue collar voters? Are they going to do it in a way that reminds people that this is what this president signed up for and he actually delivered? Or are they going to make this just about a Democratic victory? The other thing I would be very interested in looking at is what's going to happen with all of the subpoenas that the House committee has issued regarding the investigation into January 6th, because we're getting to the point now where I think the American public is beginning to also just sort of shrug its shoulders and shake its head and say, look, these Republicans defy subpoenas, they don't provide information, and there are no consequences. And so what's the committee going to do? What's Merrick Garland going to do? And to what extent is the party actually going to receive validation that, yeah, its members really are, above the rule of law?
And let me just go to that. One of them, of course, is a Rhode Islander, Michael Flynn, controversial, received an honorary degree from the University of Rhode Island, which has been much debated. But let's talk a little bit about Merrick Garland. Here he is, the U.S. Attorney General. People have thumbed their nose at this committee and refused to adhere to subpoenas. Is this all going to be a joke if Merrick Garland doesn't crack the whip?
Yeah. Yes. And I think that Merrick Garland has a reputation for being very deliberate and fair and careful and cautious.
But how complicated is this? Somebody got a subpoena from Congress. They didn't show up. How long, whether you like it,
I agree. Like, he needs to make a decision. What is he going to do? Now, you can say, I'm going to take a week or I'm going to take 2 weeks to assess the situation and make sure that I know every single piece of the law, that I know every single previous example where subpoenas have been defied, so he's going in fully armed and ready to make a case. But no, he's got to make a decision. You can't just let this go, because we're already seeing that because there have been no consequences for Steve Bannon yet, there's absolutely no incentive for any of these people to respond. And the ones that have gone to the Hill have sat there and refused to answer any question.
Yeah, I'm shocked how long it has taken him. I'd give you 24, 48 hours. If the Department of Justice hasn't been thinking about this and reviewing cases previously to the subpoenas even being issued, it's an embarrassment to the United States of America. This is, I think, raising real questions about the fairness and diligence of the Justice Department in not pursuing this with some vigor. It's sending a horrible message about the American judicial system.
So I don't disagree with that, but the one complicating factor that I think is relevant here is that the Justice Department under the Trump administration was seen as such an arm of the president himself. It was seen as so politically motivated that the reason I'm willing to give Merrick Garland a little bit more than the 24 to 48 hours is because I do think he's trying to thread this needle where he is obviously, I would assume, facing pressure to hold these people accountable, but to do it in a way that doesn't scream of partisan politics. And he himself is a victim of partisan politics, right? He should probably be on the Supreme Court right now, and instead he's in this position, which just further complicates things. So I don't give him an unlimited amount of time, and the clock is ticking, but I'm a little more patient.
I mean, Steve Bannon was a long time ago. That's not a week or two. That's a month or two.
No.
Yes.
Really? Wow, time flies when you're not having fun.
Listen, as always, thank you so much. Always appreciate. How is your book doing? Give us the overview. I missed your online version. I have it saved. I'm watching it this weekend. Give us an update on your book.
Well, the book, which argues that there are major consequences to the demise of the local news environment, is doing fine, but I would note that there is a Washington Post article either yesterday or today noting that it's possible that, some of these races in New Jersey, especially the challenger who defeated the state Senate president, a lot of the things that he said on the campaign trail, a lot of the racist attacks he'd launched were not known to voters, largely because of the decimation of the local news environment. So, this is just one more example of how you need local news to hold elected officials and candidates accountable and to provide information to voters.
Yeah, there's massive news deserts in New Jersey. New Jersey never really, had kind of one newspaper, which has been sliced and diced down to almost nothing. Those newspapers in New Jersey that are still existing are quite small. Gannett owns a lot of them. They've cut back on everything. And then just a lot of community newspapers have folded in New Jersey, decimating impact to the news gathering there. Professor, thank you as always. For everybody else, stay tuned for updates. Pay a grid of thanks to a veteran. We're here. We can talk about these issues in many cases because of those veterans who served the United States of America. Tip of the hat to all of them. For everybody else, stay safe. If you haven't gotten vaccinated, don't be Aaron Rodgers. Use your brain. Get safe. Get your family safe. Get your family protected. And if you've got a young one in school, get them vaccinated. I've seen 5-year-olds get lined up. This isn't that complicated. Thanks, everybody.